we just generally, I think men feel moved by female distress in a way that women do not feel moved by male distress. In fact, there's some evidence to suggest that women are repulsed by male distress. And that's another one of the
Mhm.
factors, I think, that has contributed to our present moment. It's contributed both to the success of feminism, because when
Yeah,
women said, hey, we are suffering, we need to
yeah.
be heard, a lot of men listened. If men hadn't been interested in women, or if men had actually hated women, or objectified them, or had contempt for them,
Mhm.
then none of the feminist
Yeah,
movement would ever have got
sorry.
off the ground. I mean, that's a fascinating question. Only the suffragettes in the United Kingdom got into the kind of level of violence and criminality that they did. And not all suffrage supporting women were violent. There was this huge split in the movement. In fact, the vast majority of women who were advocating women's suffrage did not believe that you should smash shop windows and set off bombs and put sulfuric acid and phosphorus into letter boxes, so that when the male postal workers, many of whom
Right.
themselves did not have the right to vote, when they opened up a letter bag, it would combust when
Yeah.
it mixed with the oxygen. I mean, they did terrible things. So I think there's a very strong argument to be made that hysteria actually probably maybe contributed to slowing the process of women achieving
Right.
the right to vote. It certainly didn't do anything to hasten it. Um, I mean, it's a fascinating question, really. In the 19th century, it was generally thought that the right to vote was a privilege
Mhm.
that came with it certain responsibilities. And one of the obvious responsibilities was and suffrage activists were often asked about this, the idea that the ballot was a substitute bullet, in the sense that
Mhm.
politics was war by other means. And if politics broke down, men would have to shoulder the
Mhm.
responsibility of putting their lives on the line, whether that meant, whether it was civil war or whether it was war with another country. If politics had not been successful at
Right.
resolving problems, men would have to go to war and risk their lives. So to introduce into that system voters who would never have that same responsibility was actually to introduce a fundamental incoherence into the system. So you would have voters voting for things that might bring the country to the brink of civil war or war with another country, and they would never have to bear
Mm.
that responsibility in their own persons. So it was thought that, that voting was a privilege that came with it, that responsibility. Now, that all, in the First World War might have actually confirmed that idea. Hundreds of thousands of men died
Mm.
in the trenches of Europe or were hideously maimed. And to imagine that a woman who didn't have the right to vote was somehow equally imperiled, equally hurt by that, was just a non-starter. And yet women did get the right to vote right after the First World War. It's likely that the vote would have been extended to them eventually. The 19th century was a period of democratic reform generally. And so property and income qualifications that had limited men's right to vote
Right.
right up until that point. I mean, that's the thing that almost nobody
Didn't
knows,
have the
is that
right. Yeah.
many of the
Yeah.
young men who died
Yeah.
in, yeah,
Right.
didn't have the right to vote. Well, many of them were too young to vote, but many of the men, because a 40% of British men, I don't know what percent of American men, but the United States had income and property qualifications as well. So many of those men who went off to war didn't have the right to vote either. And we have this idea that, that there was a period of centuries when all men voted and made the laws,
Mhm.
and women didn't have any rights
Right.
in that sphere at all. And it just wasn't the case. It was a much shorter period of time when the
Mhm.
franchise was progressively extended to more and more men. And women did have the right to
Yeah.
vote at local levels. It was always understood that women would be involved in their communities. They would do charity work. They voted in school board elections. And the idea that women weren't taken seriously, that their contributions didn't matter, I mean, that's simply not
Right.
true either, as I found when I was doing my research on women writers. Women were involved in the public sphere as moral leaders, as poets and novelists and journalists. One of the women that I studied, Sarah Jeanette Duncan, became a journalist in the early 1880s. She published in many newspapers. She worked for the Washington Post at one point, and as a very young woman, she said that the 1880s was a golden age for girls,
1880s.
full of new
Wow. Because what I hear
possibilities and
often is that women didn't
challenges.
have a voice until now, and that,
1880s,
that's
so
why they have to step out of the way to sort of make, 'cause that's
I
just righting a
know.
wrong.
Yes, exactly, and it just isn't true. They did have voices, they spoke out on many of the major issues of their day and were centrally
Mhm.
involved, whether that was the abolition of slavery. A lot of women who became feminists had been involved in the movement for the abolition of
Mm.
slavery in the 1830s and 1840s. They spoke out about, all sorts of issues, public schooling, especially issues having to do with children and the importance of clean milk and clean water. They spoke out on issues of cruelty to animals. They were very involved in the temperance movement, which was involved in prohibiting the manufacture and sale of alcohol. Women had many, many public
Right.
roles. And so to imagine that they were voiceless, as we hear so often, women didn't have a voice. Oh, they did indeed. And many people argued that the fact that women didn't have the right to vote didn't in any way lessen their power. In fact, there's a fascinating book by a man named Brian Harrison about opposition to the right to vote.
Mhm.
And a lot of women, were involved in the anti-suffrage movement. More women did not want women to have the right to vote
Oh,
than
really?
wanted women to have the right to vote, which
Yeah.
is a fascinating issue on its own. And
And what
and
were
yeah,
they
yeah, there were
what
all
did they
sorts of
say?
anti-suffrage societies in the 19th century. Well, they said that they believed fundamentally that women and men had separate spheres of influence and power, and that to have women begin to be involved
Mm.
directly in politics was a mistake. They felt that men and women operated best
Mhm.
when they controlled their separate sphere. And there were basic concerns about how many women were
Mhm.
actually interested enough in politics to cast an intelligent vote. And again, women did vote in local elections and school board elections, and things that they were especially interested in. And there was a concern that, that women would vote, would would vote emotionally and would tend to vote for would prefer safety over individual liberty, would vote
Mhm.
to make government larger, would vote for schemes that would involve the necessary increase in taxation because it would increase the role of government, it would increase busybody
And we see, yeah.
politicians' involvement in people's
Mhm.
lives. Like a lot of the things that people say today were
Mhm.
being said in that period as
Right.
well. So yeah, so it was a very interesting debate. And yes, some people said that the fact that women didn't have the vote didn't mean they didn't have political power, because and Brian Harrison points this out, there were all sorts of reform movements in the 19th century
Mhm.
about women's increased access to higher education, about rights in marriage, about rights in divorce, about women's health initiatives. And Harrison points out that there wasn't a single major reform movement that women were involved in. There wasn't a single one that didn't pass, even with an all-male parliament. And many people argued that the fact that women weren't directly
Mhm.
involved in politics, they didn't have party loyalties, that actually meant that they could come forward as a nonpartisan voice, and that gave them
Yeah,
greater
of
moral
course.
authority and
I didn't think
authenticity
about
than
that.
they would otherwise have. And so there were all sorts of all sorts of arguments. And also I think a lot of women felt that the women who were agitating
Mhm.
for the vote were women who didn't like men. That it really
Mhm.
wasn't even about the vote; it was about animosity towards men, that it would cause a wedge, a dividing wedge between the sexes, and that it was better to imagine that or better to insist that male voters had to vote on behalf of their entire family and community
Right.
rather than to pit women and men against one
Yeah.
another, as many
Yeah.
anti-suffragists were worried would happen. And
Mm.
it's hard to argue that that hasn't happened. And even now, like if you do polls of men and women, most women are still not very interested in politics. They tend, when they read newspapers, or we don't have newspapers so much anymore, but read news online, women, like there's a 20 to 30 point gap between men's interest in national and international politics and in economic affairs and that kind of thing. Women tend to be more interested
Yeah.
in human
Right.
interest stories, things like that,
Right.
narratives, rather than the hard facts that